The mountain had been telling them for 6 months. Cale Doran had the recordings to prove it. He'd been transmitting the seismic data since before the Vethkar even broke ground on the colony platform. Back when the survey drones were still doing their slow grid crawl across the ice shelf, and the first administration pods were being maglocked into position on the upper plateau. 6 months of pressure readings, stress fractures in the bedrock, subsonic vibrations, rising from 3 kilometers down in the mantle like something enormous turning over in its sleep. 6 months of careful documentation in the format the Vethkar administration required, filed through the correct channels. Timestamped and verified by his equipment, sent in triplicate to the Resource Extraction Coordinator, the Colonial Safety Bureau, and the Office of Administrator Vethal Sor personally. 6 months of silence in return. Doran adjusted the strap on his field recorder and exhaled a slow cloud of vapor into the 40 below air. Through the optical scope, he could see the colony platform in full, a marvel of Vethkar engineering. He'd give them that. They built fast and they built heavy. The central processing hub alone was the size of a small stadium, crouched against the upper cliff face on a dozen Magencord pylons, its extraction arrays drilling through 400 meters of ice to reach the mineral deposits below. Around it, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, the habitation rings housed 11,000 workers and support staff. And beyond those, the recreation and transit structures they'd built to attract the kind of high-value personnel who needed comfortable living conditions before they'd sign a contract for deep ice extraction on a Grade 4 planet. The grand opening had been yesterday. He'd watched it through this same scope. The ceremonial speeches, the delegation from Vethkor Central, the ribbon cutting, whatever the Vethkor equivalent of a ribbon was, some luminescent cord that dissolved when the administrator cut it with a pulse emitter. The press corps in their heated observation bubbles, the acrobatic flyers swooping arcs over the platform in formation, their exhaust trails cutting silver against the dark sky. All of it staged for the feeds. All of it designed to signal that the Vethkar had successfully opened their 107th extraction colony in this sector of the outer reach, that the ice-heavy deposits of Mirren 4 were now being responsibly developed for the good of the collective. Doran had not been invited to the ceremony. He'd been relieved of his position as Colonial Survey Naturalist 8 weeks ago, after his 4th formal warning report was returned to him with a single administrative notation. Assessment not in accordance with certified pre-construction geological survey. No action required. His access badge still worked. They hadn't gotten around to invalidating it, or perhaps they simply hadn't considered that a human naturalist with no official standing would bother staying. He'd stayed. He had his equipment, his crawler, and the prefab shelter he'd dug into the eastern snow shelf 2 kilometers from the colony perimeter. He had the recordings. He'd been waiting. He didn't know exactly what he was waiting for until the morning of the 2nd day when the mountain told him. The first indication was a change in tone. The subsonic vibrations he'd been monitoring for 6 months ran at roughly 14 hertz, just below human hearing, detectable only through his seismic array, a slow and patient resonance that had the quality of breathing. On the morning in question, that frequency jumped to 31 hertz, then 48, then dropped entirely for 4 seconds before returning at a different pitch altogether. Doran was eating a ration pack in his shelter when his equipment started screaming alerts. He was outside in his thermal suit before he'd finished swallowing. Through the scope, the colony looked entirely normal. The morning shift was beginning. He could see the tiny figures of workers moving along the transit corridors between the habitation rings, the extraction arrays cycling up for the day's operations, the supply shuttles queuing at the landing platform. The sky above the upper plateau was a bruised purple-gray, the kind of sky this planet wore for 18 hours out of every 32. Nothing looked wrong. 2 kilometers of ice beneath the platform, something had just snapped. He got back to his comm array and started transmitting. Not through official channels. Those had been closed to him. He still had the emergency contact frequency that all Colonial Survey naturalists were issued at the start of an assignment, a direct line to the Colonial Safety Bureau that was theoretically monitored regardless of the naturalist's employment status. He broadcast his data in a continuous loop. He broadcast his name and credentials. He broadcast in Vethkor Standard, and in the 3 other languages he'd learned in 11 years of working outer reach survey contracts for human crews before the Vethkor Collective had absorbed the region and started hiring humans for the lower tier positions that their own people found distasteful. Nothing came back. He thought about leaving. He had the crawler. He could be at the emergency extraction point 40 kilometers to the east within 6 hours, request pickup, and be off this planet within 48. He had documentation of everything. He had done technically what a responsible professional was required to do. He had warned them. He thought about the 11,000 people on that platform. He began breaking down his shelter instead, collapsing the prefab panels and loading them onto the crawler, moving fast and efficient in the way you learned to move when every second of warmth expenditure counted. He wasn't leaving. He was repositioning. If he was going to be useful, he needed to be closer. The woman who saved his life at the Eastgate checkpoint was named Sarah Voss. She was the colonial administrator's personal attaché, which meant she worked for Vethal Sor, which meant she was technically the last person in the colony who should have been helping Cale Doran get through a security perimeter without credentials. She was also, he would learn later, the administrator's former partner, or the Vethkar equivalent of that, some kind of professional emotional bond that had dissolved badly and left her stranded on Mirren 4 under a 1-year contract she couldn't break. She had her own reasons for being at the East Gate at 0340 colony time, none of which she explained while she was swiping a secondary access card through the reader and pulling Doran through the door before the security drone completed its sweep cycle. "You're the naturalist," she said. "Not a question." "Was," he said. "You've been broadcasting on the emergency frequency for 4 hours. Someone had to be listening." She looked at him, really looked at him, the kind of appraisal that took in the frost on his suit, the equipment cases he was dragging, the general appearance of a man who had been living in a snow shelf for 2 months and had recently been moving very fast. Whatever she calculated from that look, it brought her to a decision quickly. "What's happening to the mountain?" he told her. He showed her the data on his handheld, the 6 months of readings, the frequency change that morning, the stress fracture maps. He talked fast and assumed she was intelligent, which she was. She asked 3 precise questions. He answered them. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Vethalsor won't listen to you. He hasn't for 6 months. He won't listen to me either. We have a complicated history. I'm not interested in the history. I'm interested in getting 11,000 people away from those pylons." She looked at him again. "How long do we have?" He'd been running calculations since the frequency change. Best estimate, 8 hours. Could be 12. Could be 3. He paused. "Could be right now." She picked up his equipment case. "Then we move." Vethal Sor's administrative suite occupied the top level of the central processing hub, a curved room with a full panorama view of the plateau and the extraction arrays, and, beyond them, the ice shelf that Doran had been calling home for 2 months. The administrator was a large being, by Vethkor standards, broad through the thorax, the kind of physical presence that read as authority even to a species that hadn't evolved alongside them. He wore the formal notation bands of a senior colonial administrator, and he had the quality that Doran had come to associate with a certain type of Vethkar official, the absolute conviction that a species which had built 1,107 successful extraction colonies across 40 years of outer reach expansion had, in the process, learned everything worth knowing. He looked at Doran as though Doran were a piece of equipment that had been returned from warranty. "You were relieved of your position," Vethal Sor said. His collective standard was flawless and entirely uninflected, the accent of someone who'd learned the language for professional purposes and had never developed affection for it. "Your access to this facility has been—" "Listen to the data," Doran said. "I'm not asking for my job back. I'm asking you to look at what's happening under your pylons right now." Sarah placed the handheld on the administrator's desk. He did not look at it. The pre-construction survey. "The pre-construction survey was done in 72 hours using automated probes," Doran said. He was keeping his voice level, with the specific effort of a man who had learned, over 11 years of working with Vethkor administrators, that visible emotion from a human was the fastest way to end a conversation. "I've been monitoring this site for 6 months with continuous array deployment. The data is different. The structure of the bedrock at depth is different from what the probes returned. This planet has a geological activity cycle that your survey methodology wasn't calibrated to detect." He stopped. "The mountain is going to move. Today." Vethal Sor looked at Sarah. Something passed between them in Vethkar primary. Too fast and too nuanced for Doran's translation implant, but the emotional content was clear enough. Whatever their history was, it wasn't clean. I have the Colonial Council delegation arriving at 1100 for the production review, the administrator said finally, back in collective standard. I have extraction targets that represent 3 years of projected revenue justification. I have 11,000 workers whose contracts guarantee safe and continuous operation. He stood. I have a certified geological survey that was reviewed and approved by the Colonial Safety Bureau. The Bureau uses Veth-Car survey standards, Doran said. This is not a Veth-Core planet. The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant the conversation was over. Vethel-Sor's secondary arms, the smaller pair, the ones that handled fine manipulation and, apparently, administrative dismissal, made a gesture that needed no translation. Doran picked up the handheld. He looked at Sarah. She was looking at the panorama window, at the colony laid out below, at the ice shelf beyond the perimeter. "Thank you for your time, Administrator," Doran said. They were 4 levels down when the first tremor hit. Not the avalanche. Not yet. The tremor was a prelude, a 6-second rolling shudder that traveled through the platform structure like a slow wave, knocking people off balance in the corridors, triggering automated safety announcements, sending small unsecured objects sliding off surfaces. It was enough to make the lights flicker. It was not enough, Doran suspected, to change Veth-Sor's mind. What it was enough for was the 11,000 people in the habitation rings, who now had a lived experience of something wrong that no administrative notation could revise. "The communications hub," Sarah said. She was already moving. Doran followed. He'd been thinking about the communications hub since the second week of his self-imposed exile on the snow shelf. The colony's emergency broadcast system was designed to reach every unit in every ring simultaneously, override whatever was playing on the entertainment feeds, and deliver a mandatory evacuation instruction from any terminal with administrative-level access. The system existed because the Veth-Car, whatever their faults, had been building extraction colonies long enough to understand that sometimes you needed to tell 11,000 people to run. The access code for the communications hub was administrative level. Doran didn't have administrative level. Sarah did. She looked at him in the corridor outside the hub door, the lights still slightly wrong from the tremor. A low vibration coming up through the floor that hadn't been there this morning. He watched her work through whatever calculation she was running. The professional consequences, the personal history with Veth-Sor, the legal framework of colonial employment contracts, the weight of what was happening under the ice shelf 2 kilometers away, the faces of workers she'd probably learned over 18 months on this assignment. She pressed her hand to the scanner. The door opened. Inside, Doran went straight to the seismic display terminal. There was one in every hub, because the Veth-Car weren't entirely foolish and jacked in his external array feed. What came up on the screen was not ambiguous. The frequency had climbed past 80 hertz. The stress fracture at depth had propagated laterally for an estimated 340 meters in the past 4 hours. 3 of the 12 mag anchor pylons showed anomalous load readings. He began composing the broadcast. He wrote it in collective standard first, then flagged it for auto-translation to the 6 other languages represented in the colony's workforce manifest. He wrote it the way he'd been trained to write emergency communications during his first year in survey work, by an old woman named Chandra who'd been doing outer reach naturalist work for 30 years and had once talked an entire mining crew out of a methane pocket collapse, using nothing but a calm voice and specific instructions. Tell them what is happening. Tell them what to do. Tell them where to go. Tell them they have time if they move now. He looked at Sarah. She nodded. He hit broadcast. "Attention all personnel. This is an emergency seismic advisory. Geological instability has been detected in the substrate beneath the primary pylon grid. This is not a drill. All personnel in the central hub and extraction arrays are directed to move immediately to the designated perimeter shelters at grid coordinates 7 Alpha, 9 Bravo, and 12 Delta. All personnel in habitation rings 1 through 6 move to the southern transit corridor and follow emergency egress markers to the landing platform. All personnel in rings 7 through 12 use northern egress. Transport to the emergency extraction point will be coordinated from the landing platform. You have time if you move now. Move now." He repeated it 3 times, then set it on loop. For approximately 4 seconds after the first broadcast, nothing happened. Then the corridor outside the communications hub filled with the sound of 11,000 people beginning to believe it. The evacuation was not clean. It never is, and Doran had never expected it to be. He'd seen 2 emergency evacuations in 11 years of outer reach work, and both of them had involved a specific human chaos. People grabbing wrong things, going wrong directions, stopping to ask questions of anyone who looked like they knew something, helping strangers they'd spoken to for the first time 90 seconds ago. The Veth car evacuated differently. They moved fast, and they moved in coordinated patterns, their pheromone communication allowing a kind of distributed situational awareness that no human crowd could match. What they did not do in a crisis that overran their pre-assigned emergency protocols was improvise. The Eastern Transit Corridor was the problem. It was the most direct route from the habitation rings to the landing platform. And within 6 minutes of the broadcast, it was packed to a standstill. Not because the Veth Cower were panicking, but because 3 of them near the front of the crowd had received conflicting emergency protocol signals and stopped to resolve the conflict, and the 4,000 beings behind them had simply stopped too, waiting for the resolution, while the mountain continued its work beneath the ice. Doran found this out from a young worker named Prith, human, from the agricultural processing section of Ring 4, who came running toward the communications hub with the specific expression of someone who has just watched 4,000 people doing nothing while a building was preparing to fall on them. "The East Corridor's locked up," Prith said. "They're just standing there." Doran was already grabbing his equipment. How many humans in that corridor? I don't know. Hundreds, maybe. Sarah was on the hub's internal comm, already trying to reach whoever was managing the northern egress. Doran looked at Prith. Prith was maybe 22. Frost still on his collar from whatever work he'd been doing outside, eyes wide but steady, the kind of young person who'd run toward a problem rather than away from it. "Can you shout?" Doran asked. "What?" Loudly, in a voice that carries. Prith blinked. "Yeah, I can shout. Good. Come with me." The second tremor hit when they were halfway down the Eastern Transit Corridor, and this one was not 6 seconds. This one was 20. A deep rolling violence that sent cracks up the corridor walls and knocked half the lighting array from the ceiling and brought the standing crowd of 4,000 beings from frozen indecision into something that could have been a stampede. Would have been a stampede. Doran had positioned himself and Prith at the choke point, in front of the 3 Veth car who were still attempting to resolve their protocol conflict by committee. And when the tremor hit and the crowd began to surge, he did the thing he had learned to do in every emergency his body had ever been present for. He got loud. Not panicked loud, not desperate loud. The specific tone his voice could reach when he needed a room to stop. A tone that had something to do with projection and something to do with conviction and something to do with the fact that, as Chandra had told him 30 times over 2 years of training, emergencies respond to the appearance of someone who knows what they're doing. And knowing what you're doing is mostly just deciding to act like it. This way. Single file. Move through on the left. Do not stop. You have time if you move now. Prith, bless him, started doing the same, pointing and gesturing, his voice cracking but carrying. The Veth car at the choke point looked at the 2 humans doing something loud and direct and apparently purposeful, and whatever they read in that, the body language, the tone, some cross-species communication that didn't require translation, they stepped aside. The corridor began to move. Doran kept shouting directions. He didn't stop. His throat began to hurt at about the 4-minute mark, and he kept going. Prith moved to the other side of the corridor and did the same. Between them, they ran a human vocal traffic system for 11 minutes. In a corridor built for different species on a planet they were technically trespassers on, until the crowd had thinned enough that the remaining Veth Corps emergency coordinators could take over. Then the mountain moved for real. The sound came first. A crack that started somewhere distant and traveled fast. The way sounds traveled through structure rather than air, arriving as vibration in the soles of his boots and the bones of his jaw before it ever reached his ears. Then the secondary sound, the surface sound, a vast and sustained roar that had been waiting under the ice for longer than the colony had existed and was now expressing itself without restraint. Doran had gotten himself to one of the support columns near the corridor junction, solid mag and cord construction with a handrail designed for Veth Corps grip geometry that was entirely wrong for human hands. He held on anyway. Prith was beside him, both hands locked around the column's reinforcement ring, eyes wide, watching the far end of the corridor where the exterior wall was doing something it was not designed to do. The first pylon failed at 0847, according to Doran's suit chronometer. He knew this because the entire eastern section of the central hub dropped approximately 40 centimeters in the time it takes to blink, accompanied by a sound like the planet objecting to everything that had been done to it. The mag anchors on pylons 2 through 5 held for 8 seconds. Then 4 through 5 went, and the outer wall of the corridor peeled back like skin, and the ice shelf, the beautiful, terrible 400-meter deep ice shelf that Doran had been living beside for 2 months and reading like a slow book, came in. It was not cinematic. That was the thing he'd never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't seen a structural catastrophe in person. They imagined it like a wave, like something you could watch roll toward you. What it actually was a change in the rules. 1 second there was a wall, and the next second there was not. And where the wall had been was a pressure front of compressed ice and gas and shattered construction material, moving at a velocity that made the question of individual survival purely statistical. He held on. He told his hands to hold on. He closed his eyes because there was nothing useful to see and focused on the column under his palms and the sounds that were information versus the sounds that were just noise. And he held on. The column held. The roar lasted 41 seconds. He counted. When it stopped, the corridor was dark, except for emergency lighting, half full of ice debris and ceiling material, and very cold. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in under a minute. He felt it immediately. The specific bite that meant suit insulation was not going to be enough for long exposure. He opened his eyes. Prith was still there, still attached to the column. His left arm was at an angle that suggested problems, and there was blood on his face from something, but he was breathing. "You're okay," Doran said, which was more intention than assessment. "I don't think I'm okay," Prith said. "You're breathing and thinking. That's okay enough. Can you move your legs?" Prith moved his legs. His left arm shifted and he made a sound, but the legs worked. "Good," Doran said. "We're going to move north." What happened in the following 3 hours was not a story about Cale Doran. He'd be clear about that afterward when people asked. It was a story about how many people, working separately and then together in rubble and cold and bad light, were capable of doing useful things for strangers. The field medic he found in the collapsed section of Ring 3, working alone on 6 injured Veth car workers with nothing but her kit and the kind of calm that looks like she wasn't scared, who turned out to be scared, she told him later, but had decided that scared and working was better than scared and not working. The 2 Veth core engineers who had gotten themselves to a structurally sound section of the central hub and were already rerouting backup power to the northern egress corridor, not because anyone told them to, but because they'd looked at what needed doing and done it. The colony's transport coordinator, Veth Kaur, formal notation bands of a mid-level administrator, the kind of official who in Doran's experience usually required 18 forms before authorizing a shuttle, who had commandeered every atmospheric transport vehicle on the landing platform and was running evac flights to the emergency extraction point on a 17-minute cycle without waiting for authorization from anyone. Vethal Sor. Doran found him in the rubble of the eastern hub section at the 2-hour mark, cut off from the main evacuation corridors by a secondary collapse, with 3 members of his administration staff and an injured Colonial Council delegate who had arrived the previous day for the production review. He was attempting to clear the obstruction with tools designed for administrative use. He was not making significant progress. Doran looked at him across the debris. The administrator looked back. His secondary arms were doing the small, rapid movement that Doran associated with high stress, the Veth car equivalent of a jaw working silently. Doran had the geological survey kit. He always had the geological survey kit. Among its instruments was a hydraulic spreader intended for use in extracting core samples from compressed ice and rock formations, with a rated separation force of 12 metric tons. It was not designed for structural rescue. It worked anyway. They didn't speak. Doran got the spreader into the obstruction and worked it methodically, reading the debris stack the way he read geological formations, load-bearing elements, stress transfer, the logic of how things failed, and what you could move without triggering the next failure. It took 20 minutes. When the gap was clear enough, Vethal Sor moved his people through, and then moved through himself, and then turned back. "Your assessment was accurate," the administrator said. Doran was packing the spreader. "Yes." The pre-construction survey protocol is inadequate for this class of geological environment. Yes, a pause. You could have left when your position was terminated. Doran looked at him. 11,000 people. The administrator's notation bands shifted, some formal gesture that Doran didn't know the precise meaning of, but which felt, in context, like something. Yes, said Vethalsor, 11,000 people. They got out 9,412. The remaining 1,600. Doran would learn later. In the debrief that lasted 4 days at the emergency extraction point, in the subsequent formal inquiry that lasted 11 months, were almost entirely accounted for by the initial structural failure in the pylon grid, before the evacuation broadcast, before anyone had moved. The people who had died in the first 90 seconds of the event, in the sections of the colony built directly over pylon cluster 4 and 5, which bore the highest load concentration and failed first. He held that number for a long time, turning it over, 9,412. He'd written the broadcast, he'd run the corridor, he'd made the spreader work. He'd arrived at the East Gate at 0340 with his cases and his data and his refusal to leave. 1,600 he hadn't saved. The medic, her name was Reyes. He learned it properly at the debrief, sat down next to him on the third evening at the extraction point. When most of the immediate medical work was done, and the population of saved people were wrapped in emergency thermal sheets and eating whatever the relief ships had brought. She'd been at the formal inquiry session, listening to the numbers. You know what you actually did, she said. I know what the numbers are. Numbers are what was. What you did is different. She looked at him. She had the look of someone who'd been doing emergency medicine long enough to know the difference between the two. You warned them 6 months ago. You stayed. You broadcast. You ran the corridor. She paused. 1,600 people died in the first 90 seconds before your broadcast even reached anyone. You didn't cause those deaths. You prevented the other 8,000. Doran didn't answer for a while. Chandra used to say, he said eventually, that the job isn't to save everybody. The job is to be the person who shows up. Who's Chandra? Someone who taught me how to talk in an emergency. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Well, she said, she taught you right. The formal inquiry took 11 months. The findings, when they were published in Collective Standard and automatically translated to 47 languages across the outer reach, covered 12 pages of regulatory revision, 6 pages of geological survey protocol amendment, and 3 pages of administrative accountability assessment. Vethalsor was demoted and assigned to a desk position in resource compliance. The Colonial Safety Bureau updated its outer reach survey standards to require continuous multispectrum geological monitoring for any extraction colony on a geologically active Grade 4 world, using methodology and array specifications drawn largely from the equipment manifest of one Cale Duran, naturalist, survey grade 7, currently unemployed. The relevant portion of the inquiry findings regarding the events of the evacuation itself read in part, the rapid and successful evacuation of 9,412 of an estimated 11,028 personnel represents an outcome significantly exceeding actuarial models for this class of structural event. This outcome is attributable in substantial part to the early broadcast of emergency instructions and to the improvised coordination of evacuation movement in the Eastern Transit Corridor. The effectiveness of these interventions is further attributable to the prior collection of geological monitoring data over a 6-month period, which provided the basis for an accurate assessment of event timing and severity. The Commission notes that the individual primarily responsible for these interventions, a human naturalist operating without official credentials or administrative authority at the time of the event, appears to have acted from personal conviction rather than institutional obligation. Doran read that section of the report twice, in a small room at the redeployment center on Mirren Station, where he was waiting to hear whether his survey license had been reinstated. He thought about Nick Thorne, his first survey mentor, not Chandra, the earlier one, the one who'd found him fresh out of the certification program and hauled him out to a survey site on a gas giant moon and made him spend 6 weeks just listening to what the geology was saying before he was allowed to make a single report. Nick had been the one who'd told him that the work of survey naturalism was not the work of discovery. The collective had enough discovery, but the work of testimony. You went out, you listened, you brought back what you'd heard, and you told it clearly to the people who needed to hear it. That was the whole job. The job had not changed. He heard the notification chime from the licensing bureau. His license had been reinstated with a notation, Field Service recognized. Grade elevation to survey grade 9 pending review. He sat in the small room for a moment longer. Then he picked up his equipment cases, the same ones he'd dragged through the East Gate checkpoint at 0340. On the morning, the Mountain decided it was done being patient, and he walked out to see what the next planet was telling him. Outside the station window, Mirren 4 was a gray-white crescent in the dark, trailing a long scar of disturbed ice shelf across its southern hemisphere. Visible from orbit, a permanent mark that the Mountain had made when it finally said everything it had been building to say. Doran looked at it for a moment. He'd listened. That was the whole job.